Good evening. We are now in the another chapter of our discussion for the obligations and contracts for the final term. For articles 1291 to 1304, chapter 16, Novation. We've discussed earlier that novation is one of the modes of extinguishment of a certain obligations. So we will discuss this one, the particular provisions about novation. Article 1291. Obligations may be modified by first, changing their object or principal conditions. Second, substituting the person of the debtor. Third, subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. If you're going to modify a certain obligations, the prevailing rule is the Article 1291. So you have to follow of the following modified rule when it comes to obligations. Novation is the substitution or change of an obligation by another, resulting in its extinguishment or modification, either by changing its object or principal conditions, or by substituting another in place of the debtor, or by subrogating a third person in the rights of a creditor. For example, if A is a debtor and A is indebted to B amounting to 10,000 pesos, and C, the third person, is also indebted to A. So technically, A could subrogate his liability to B to C. So pwedeng sabihin ni A, o doon ka na lang maningil kay C because si C ay may utang din sa akin. So that is one of a kind of novation. You are novating your liabilities to B, no? Ibinigay mo na kay C. So si C na ngayon ang liable to pay the 10,000 pesos to B. Okay? So that is one of a kind of novation. You're novating your liabilities. And in order for innovation to exist, there are four essential requisites. So kung walang in any of the following requisites, no, kung hindi siya present, then walang novation na mangyayari or walang novation na nangyayari. Okay, first, a previous valid obligation. So there should be a valid obligation. Second, agreement of the parties to the new obligation. Since you are subrogating your rights, there should be a new obligation and there should be an agreement. Otherwise, the innovation will not take effect. And third, extinguishment of the old obligation. Since there is already a subsequent obligation or a new obligation, so technically the old obligation is already extinguished by virtue of the subsequent obligation, no, as agreed by both parties. And the fourth one, the validity of the new obligation. So before the innovation will take its effect, it should have though there is a new obligation, so the party should see to it that this new obligation is valid. Otherwise, walang novation na magaganap o walang novation na mangyayari. And there are three kinds of novation. They are classified, no, according to kinds. The first one is objective or real. The second one is subjective or personal. And the third one is mixed. So it could either be objective or real, or it could be subjective or personal. And the first kind, the objective or real obligation, novation, refers to the change either in the cause, object, or principal conditions of the obligations. So it could be if it could be a cause, no, yung i-change mo. It could be the object of certain obligations, or it could be the principal conditions itself. The second one is subjective or personal novation. On the other hand, it refers to the substitution of the person of the debtor or to the subrogation of a third person in the rights of the creditor. So when you talk about subjective or personal novation, it is the change of a person, no, or a debtor. When you talk about objective or real novation, then it refers to the object. When there is a substitution of the person of the debtor, it is called passive. When there is subrogation in the rights of the creditor, it is called active. So you have to take note on this. And mixed novation refers to a combination of objective and subjective novation. So ibig sabihin, ang isang obligation may consist, if it is mixed novation, may consists objective or real novation and subjective or personal novation if it is mixed novation. Article 1292, in order that an obligation may be extinguished by another which substitutes the same, it is imperative that it be so declared in unequivocal terms, or that the old and the new obligations be on every point incompatible with each other. So if there is inconsistency as to the old and new obligations, then it should be repealed, no, before it will take its effect, before the party will enforce the novation. No, otherwise, magkakaproblema in the later part, no, if there is complaint coming from both parties or coming from a third person. Form of extinguishment. One of the essential requisites of novation is the extinguishment of the previous obligation by the new one. So if there is a subsequent obligation, or if there is new obligation, then technically the old obligation extinguished. Now, are the previous obligation extinguished because there is already a valid new obligation. But if it is not valid obligation, then the previous one will take the previous one is still enforceable. Okay. Now the question, was there a novation of the mortgage loan contract? Now the answer is no. Well settled is a rule that with respect to obligation to pay a sum of money, the obligation is not novated by an instrument that expressly recognizes the old, changes only the terms of payment, adds other obligations not incompatible with the old ones, or the new contract merely supplements the old one. So technically, it did not repeal the old one, but rather it only changes the terms and conditions, or it only adds another obligation to a certain contract. Because if there is a total novation of the old obligations, no, lahat talaga ng konsepto, lahat talaga ng content doon sa novation, sa old obligation, most likely ma-repealed siya lahat. No, otherwise if there is only additional or adds other obligations, then it could not extinguish the old one. Express novation, when we talk about express novation, it is in the form of a, it is in a written form. Now, in order that an obligation may be expressly extinguished by another which substitute the same, it is imperative that it be so declared in unequivocal terms. Express novation can therefore take place only when the intention to effect a novation clearly results from the terms of the agreement or is shown by a full discharge of the original debt. So you have to take note on the original debt. So in other words, it can only take place when the contracting parties disclose that the object in making the new contract is to extinguish the old one. You have to take note that the objective in making the new one is to extinguish the old one. Otherwise, the old contract remains in force. Yung sinabi ko kanina, if there is if the new obligation is not valid, then the old contract remains in force, and the new one is added to it. Okay. Consequently, the mere fact that the debtor had signed a second promissory note for the balance of his indebtedness does not mean the extinguishment of the first promissory note, wherein the terms of payment were expressly stipulated. Those terms therefore shall still govern the manner of liquidation of the said balance. We have also implied novation. So there are two. So it's either express or implied novation. In order that an obligation may be impliedly extinguished by another which substitute the same, it is imperative that the old and the new obligations must be incompatible with each other on every point. So you have to take note the word every point of the agreement. Next, 1293. Novation, which consists in substituting a new debtor in the place of the original one, may be made even without the knowledge or against the will of the latter, but not without the consent of the creditor. Payment of the new debtor gives him the rights mentioned in Articles 1236 and 1237. Now, what is the effect of payment by new debtor? With regard to the relation between the original debtor and the new debtor, since donation cannot be presumed in such case, justice demands that the original debtor shall reimburse to the new debtor whatever benefits he may have derived therefrom. So you have to take note of the word shall reimburse to the new debtor whatever benefits he may have derived. Article 1294, if the substitution is without the knowledge or against the will of the debtor, the new debtor's insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation shall not give rise to any liability on the part of the original debtor. So in 1294, for example, the debtor is substituted with a new debtor, without the consent of the original debtor. So kung walang consent coming from the original debtor, and then nagkaroon ng substitution by the new debtors, according to 1294, the new debtors insolvency, kung halimbawa si debtors, yung new debtors na nag-substitute sa original debtor, ay nagkaroon ng insolvency or hindi niya na-fulfill or there's non-fulfillment of the obligation, yung lahat ng obligation na dapat sanang i-fulfill niya. Shall not give, so you have to take note, shall not give rise to any liability on the part of the original debtor. So dahil the original debtor was substituted without his consent, kung anong mangyayari na mga kapalpakan ni new debtors yung na-substitute, si original debtor is not liable anymore because hindi siya nag-inform na he will substitute in behalf of the original debtor. 1295. The insolvency of the new debtor who has been proposed by the original debtor and accepted by the creditor shall not revive the action of the latter against the original obligor, except when said insolvency was already existing and of the public knowledge, or known to the debtor when he delegated his debt. Now, what is the effect of non-payment of new debtor since it was already substituted, no? The old debtor was already substituted with a new debtor. So what happened? The effect of non-payment o hindi siya nagbayad. As a general rule, novation by substitution of the person of the debtor, whether by expromission or by delegation, has the effect of releasing the original debtor from his obligation to the creditor, and at the same time of substituting the new debtor there. So this is very self-explanatory. No? How about effect upon accessory obligations? The rule stated in the above article is necessary consequence of the principle that an accessory obligation is dependent upon the principal obligation to which it is subordinated. As I have said, when the when the accessory obligation is extinguished, it will not affect the principal obligation. However, if the principal obligation is already extinguished, then it will affect the accessory obligation. Article 1297, if the new obligation is void, again, the original one shall subsist, unless the parties intended that the former relation should be extinguished in any event. So if the new obligation is void, no, kung hindi siya ka-approve because there are lacking requisites, no, in order for the new obligation to be enforceable. I mean, to be enforced. No? Now the original one shall subsist. So it will take effect kung ano mang yung mga stipulation sa obligation, unless the parties intended that the former relation should be extinguished in any event. Article 1298. The novation is void if the original obligation was void, except when annulment may be claimed only by the debtor, or when ratification validates acts which are voidable. If new and or old obligations are void, so paano yan kung even the old, no, obligations are also void aside from new? Among the essential requisites of novation, whether objective or subjective, are the validity of the new obligation and the existence of a previous valid obligation. The first is deductible from the provision of article, while the second is expressly stated by the provision of Article 1298. And these requisites are logical because the purpose of novation is the substitution of the new obligation for the old. In order to effect the novation, it is therefore essential that both the old and the new obligation must be valid. Because at the end of the day, kayo lang din ang magiging karamay, no, when it comes to challenges na darating. Article 1299, if the original obligation was subject to a suspensive or resolutory condition, the new obligation shall be under the same condition, unless it is otherwise stipulated. Article 300, subrogation of a third person in the rights of the creditor is either legal or conventional. Okay? The former is not presumed, except in cases expressly mentioned. In this code, the latter must be sufficiently established. Okay. Novation by subrogation. The second method whereby personal novation may be effected is by subrogating a third person and the rights of the creditor. Article 1301. Conventional subrogation of a third person requires the consent of the original parties and of the third person. So you have to inform, you have to seek um, approval, no, from the original parties and of the third person. Otherwise, magkakaproblema tayo. Conventional subrogation must be clearly established in order that it may take effect. This necessarily follows from the fact that in conventional subrogation, it is essential that there must be an agreement of all the parties with respect to this subrogation. Now, in Article 1302, it is presumed that there is legal subrogation. Now, first, when a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred, even without the debtor's knowledge. So there is also an exception, even if without the debtor's knowledge. Pwede ba? The correct answer is uh, so kailangan talaga if kung gusto mo talagang there is legal subrogation, you have to inform the occupant or the previous occupant of the said parcels of land or said property. Okay? When the third person not interested in the obligation pays with the express or tacit approval of the debtor. Third one, when, even without the knowledge of the debtor, a person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation pays. Now, what is the concept of legal subrogation? Or kailan ba nangyayari ang legal subrogation? Legal subrogation is that which takes place without agreement of the parties, but by operation of law because of certain certain acts. Instances of legal subrogation are those provided in this article, 1302 of the new civil. 1303, subrogation refers to the person subrogated the credit with all the rights thereto appertaining, either against the debtor or against the third persons, be they grantors or possessors of mortgages, subject to stipulation in a conventional subrogation. Okay, so that is Article 1303. 1304, the creditor to whom partial payment has been made may exercise his right of the remainder. Okay, you have to take note kung si creditor daw to whom partial payment has been made may exercise his right for the remainder. Ibig sabihin yung kung magkano na. Okay? And he shall be preferred to the person who has been subrogated in his place in virtue of the partial payment of the same credit. Now, what is the effect of total subrogation? Now, in a contract, there is also this kind of effect. So, paano kung so here, pwede naman no, sa third person if you will subrogate your liabilities to a third person, pwede din naman. How about effect of partial subrogation? The effect of partial subrogation is given in Article 1304. Thus, if P, a third person, pays two-thirds of the indebtedness of the DOC, such payment shall result in the partial subrogation of P and the rights of the creditor ceases the subrogation. In other words, both rights shall coexist. Perhaps at the end of the discussion with regard to the novation. Okay, thank you and hope you enjoy reading. You have to read a lot because this subject is your major, and it is not also an um, easy subject, no, sa accounting. So you have to take note because this is very important uh, subject, very important when it comes to content. Okay.